All right, now that we know that we have bristle-tipped brushes, let's take a look at what those are and how to adjust them. Before we even get that far into these beautiful settings though, we'll notice that we have more than one kind of brush, even though they look like little erasers for the most part. Those are different brushes. And we also have some tiny pencils, and we have some tiny airbrushes. What are all these? What's going on here? And by the way, if you don't see these in your brush tip shape preview window, you can just reload your brushes under your brush palette using the flyout menu and following the instructions from an earlier video. So let's just take a look at what these tips are via a diagram that I've written out for you. So we have different kinds of bristle tips. We have the round tips, which have the little lighter filled brushes here at the top. And we have our flat tips, which have these dark ones going on. So for every type of round, there's a corresponding flat. For example, the point looks like a standard brush that you might have gotten in an old set of Crayola paint by numbers. And then the flat version of it looks more like one of those carpenter pencils, the kind of weird flat pencils that you'll occasionally find around and about. That's what a carpenter pencil is. The blunt tip looks like an eraser or a sort of squashed eraser, and the angle is essentially just that cut at an angle and then flattened for the flat one. It makes sense. Curved is more like your fingertip just being pressed down, and then you have a flattened version of that. Youch. The fan brush is like the classic blush brush that came in makeup kits, and then there's a flat version of that as well. Now each of these gets modeled as we click on them, and if you can't see the teeny weeny little icons very well, that's not a problem. If you mouse over one, you should get a pop-up tooltip that says which one it is, like the round blunt or the flat curved or the flat blunt. So why have a round one and a flat one? Well, the reason has to do with if you have rotation enabled on a Wacom tablet, or if you want to go into your brush pose and just rotate it yourself. Flats are amazing for that. Because the brush is flat, and let me load one up for you, it has different sides. Let me pop over to brush pose and hopefully toggle the preview because it's flipping out. There we go. As I rotate my brush, you can see it is indeed very thin. It's been flattened out. That's all. That's amazing for using a Wacom pen that supports rotation, but if you don't have that, you still get some really great effects out of it. Or if you'd prefer not to have some randomized effects occurring, you can use your brush pose, or you can just use the round. As we saw earlier, the round version of these are perfectly round. So as we rotate it, we'll see the bristles move around, but we won't actually see any real change occurring on the brush. Pretty nifty. The exception, of course, being the angled brush where we should see it spinning around, unless I am sorely mistaken. Let's find out. If I find my round angle brush, pop on over to my brush pose, and then toggle this on and off if it gets jammed. There we go. Rotation does indeed have it rotating in space. The one exception to the round brush being completely identical regardless of how it's rotated. So that gives us our brush types and our bristle tip types, but how do we control those? Let me turn off the diagram and scroll on up to layer 7, which is just a blank layer. Turn off brush pose for just a moment and pop over to brush tip shape. Now, if you don't want to hunt and peck looking for the different kinds of brushes, you can simply go to your bristle quality shape. And when you click it, check it out. Everything on the diagram, the round point, the round blunt, the round curved, the round angle, the round fan, and the corresponding flat point, flat blunt, flat curve, flat angle, and flat fan. So we don't have to hunt and peck for any of them past the first one. We simply click it, and there it is. So that brings up the next question. What do all of these guys do? Well, we can get a pretty good idea pretty quickly. Bristles is the amount of fill-in bristles. You can have a very thin amount, and you can see that this changes the type of stroke and the way that it behaves straight away. Length is the length of the bristles rather than the amount of them. How long are they? If you make some stumpy ones, you can actually make great texture really quickly. If you're doing hair, this can be very, very useful, fast way of building up hair on your figure. Same with fur and grass, all kinds of good stuff like that. These are great for that. Notice that it does also have spacing, but it behaves a little bit differently. You can create a sort of dot texture with it as you decrease or increase the spacing. I'm going to go ahead and have a low spacing so we get a nice smooth transition, but don't forget that it is there. You have the thickness of the individual brushes, and that, of course, corresponds to the thickness of the lines. I'm going to make this a little longer so we can get a better result on that. And it seems kind of goopy, and we don't seem to have a big change, mostly because of how wiggly this is. See how it's just flying around as I move? Well, that has to do with stiffness. Let me clear this out. Notice that we can control how stiff it is. Oops, I accidentally deleted my layer. Let me bring that back. All right, so we'll go ahead and crank up the thickness, the stiffness to 100%. And look, the brush doesn't really respond at all. Now it's behaving more like how one of our capture brushes would. Now, that's not necessarily true. If we change things like pressure, it will change the dynamics of the brush. In other words, how it responds to things if you have a pressure-sensitive tool like a Wacom pen. We also have the angle, which changes, surprise, surprise, the angle of the bristles. Let's go ahead and do that with a much lower stiffness, a lot more bristles that are nowhere near as thick. Now, these are looking a lot alike, and that has to do with the fact that our brush pose isn't changing. Rather than stop here and adjust my brush pose every time, I'm just going to grab my Wacom pen, and now you can see it all in action. With the pressure sensitivity, you can see that a light touch can create a really interesting effect. The bristles behave differently according to how I've modeled them, which means I can get texture before or even during a stroke. And let's go ahead and double check that that in fact is a transparency by turning on this blue. Look at that. It's not that we're getting any kind of weird pinks or anything. That's just an illusion caused by the light transparency on it. This isn't a color shift, this is an opacity shift. And that, as I adjust the angle of the bristles yet again, that is the miraculous and amazing bristle brush. That leaves us with a few more brushes. Wow, we've almost made it to the end of this video set. Oh, but before we do move on, I should probably show you the different brush tips for the bristle brush. So tune in the next video for a quick overview of all of the shapes in action. See you in a minute.